recording, and welcome if you are on Facebook. As everybody comes in, as everybody gets settled. My wife just poked her head in and she said, Joe, that was incredible. And I know whenever she's saying that, it's always about my guest, not about me. So, you know, I made her happy. So that's important. Tom, that was amazing. And it's also just great to watch a pro in action. And one of the things I often say is you can't fake authenticity. You either are or you aren't. Yeah. And I think that I think what we need now is a different kind of infection. We need the infection of positivity and passion and knowledge and philosophy.
You're absolutely right. And why not? Let's try to spread some of that, and then people, unlike some things that are spread, there are a lot of people purporting to give good advice about how to deal with difficulties and how to be successful. And it's not always good advice. It's not always sound advice. So if we can get it's counterfeit wisdom, basically. And if we can get the real thing out there, people won't be as fooled by the counterfeit. So that's important, I think. I think I see on our screen, Joseph. Hey, Joseph, how you doing? I see you got guitars behind you there. What have you got?
That's the running joke. My wife and my child, my oldest 8-year-old, play guitar. I don't. I just pretend I do on TV. So
that's good. That's good. Well, you can probably see behind me, I've got a Carolina blue Fender Stratocaster. I've got a silver one over there, a purple Telecaster, nice. A raspberry Stratocaster. I'm surrounded by.
You're the real deal. I'm a poser. So
I used to be a long time ago.
I'm a poser too. I've also got my I walked into a Sam Ash or one of those music stores, and I said, I want the cheapest men's left-handed guitars you have, the cheapest one. And I think I can play about 3 or 4 chords, but I'm learning how to play the guitar.
Was that Sam Ash in New York City on 48th Street?
No, this one was it Sam Ash? This was one in New Haven, but I think it's like a franchise.
In New Haven. I bought a lot of guitars in New Haven, Connecticut years ago when I was at Yale. There was
a place called, you were at
Brian Guitars. Yeah, it was a guitar store not far from my house. I would work all day on philosophy and then just have to blow off some steam. So I'd go sit at this guitar store for 2 hours and just play with the good people. And the Doobie Brothers would come in and buy guitars, and Bruce Springsteen's bass player would come in, and just all kinds of interesting people in New Haven. It was a long time ago.
If I'd known that, I would have hung out there more. So I wanted to ask you a few little questions, more just based on. Well, I wanted to ask you about your book on Apple or Steve Jobs. I wanted to ask you. There's so much to unpack, and I'll actually, the way that we run the after show now is, and one of our regulars, Bob, has just arrived, is Bob and Joey. It's almost like The View. We're the View of global pandemics, basically. I'm not sure that image is working. So I'm sure they may have questions. And then sometimes we have people on Facebook and people that are on the Zoom that just stay off camera. Maybe they'll send me a chat or a question. So I don't want to hog your time or you. I want to share the love. But my question, just to get the ball rolling, is who is your favorite philosopher of all time? It's almost like a baseball player. And then recently, I know you mentioned J.K. Rowling, but who would you say is one of your favorite philosophers of current times in recent days?
It's interesting that you asked that, because Aristotle, the reason I used his name in the book, If Aristotle Ran General Motors, the book wasn't really that much about Aristotle, but whenever I came up with a crucial problem I couldn't think of a good solution to, he usually had the answer in one of his books, the Eudemian Ethics, based on the Greek word for happiness, and the Nicomachean Ethics, dedicated to his son Nicomachus. But he would often have the puzzle pieces would fit together with Aristotle. Aristotle was wrong about a lot of things, like every other great philosopher, but he was right about some pretty important things. And so he's always been my go-to guy for real insight on something that's otherwise really puzzling. But he's not the easiest to read because his books are his most advanced students' lecture notes for his upper classes. So it was never really meant to be read by a broad public. But you get guys like the Roman Stoics, for example, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. They're really easy to read. They're fun to read, and they're packed full of insights. I mean, like the stuff we were talking about today. Seneca has this amazing image of a boxer. He says, no boxer enters the ring with true confidence until he's been beaten black and blue, until he's felt his teeth rattle under his opponent's fists, until he's tasted the floor as a result of an onslaught. Then he can enter the ring with genuine confidence, knowing what he can endure. Epictetus had this image too. He said, you like this. He said, imagine you set as a goal to become an Olympic wrestler. And let's suppose you had resources. So you hired the best coach to coach you to be an Olympic wrestler. What's this guy going to do? He's going to throw at you every obstacle, every adversity, every struggle he can think of. He's going to bring guys to wrestle against you who are the strongest, the toughest, the meanest, the youngest. And rather than complaining about this, you got to realize he's trying to create in you strength, agility, and wisdom for wrestling. Well, what is life doing? Epictetus says, we're being prepared for something much more important than an athletic event. We're being prepared for a spiritual contest in life, and the stuff that comes our way, the adversaries, the obstacles, it's meant to cultivate in us strength, agility, and wisdom. Same three things. So I love to read people like that. So the Stoics are really important to me. Mary Shelley is unheralded as a philosopher. The book Frankenstein is one of the best philosophical studies on success ever. It's like a cautionary tale. There's this brilliant guy who seemed to do everything right on the surface to attain a goal, and he unleashes a monster he can't control as a result. So I've been working on a book for 5 years, and I think I finished last week. And the working title is The Frankenstein Factor, Monster Success and Massive Failure, where I use Mary, 2 of her books. And by the way, her other book that I use is called The Last Man, which, get this, it's about a pandemic in the 21st century that kills everybody except one guy. And it's unbelievable. She wrote this, she published it in 1826, I think it was. Frankenstein was 1818. But I use Gilgamesh and Beowulf and Moby Dick and Don Quixote and the Iliad and the Odyssey and Xenophon's Education of Cyrus. There's all this great literature, philosophers that I love to read that aren't often thought of as philosophers. So yeah, thanks for that question. It gave me a chance to just share with you a lot of my recent enthusiasms.
It's amazing because in addition to this idea of asking questions, what strikes me is it's all about lessons. It's all about insights and inferences and connections. And I think, and I wonder whether, I would imagine the answer is absolutely, that when we look back at some of the teachings and the lessons and I don't even know if preaching is the right word, of some of these philosophers, if we have inferred or created a new meaning to what they had originally said or intended even, I guess that's part of the dynamism of it, right? And how it lives forever.
Yeah, it is. It's like what we said a few minutes ago about a good metaphor. We'll always have more than one resonance in our lives, always more than one application. Same way with a good novel or a good epic poem. There will just be endless riches there. Why did it become a classic? Like, why are people reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, 150 generations later or whatever it is? Because there's something there for everybody. There's something there for every generation. And we can only hope in our own time to do things that will resonate with people deeply and multiply, and they'll see things. That's what I loved about Notre Dame. I would have students sometimes I taught in the 8th of the student body. I had these big classes, and there would be kids not only from the Midwest and the East Coast and the West Coast, there'd be kids from Brazil and Argentina and England and Spain. And my class would just be this diverse mass of humanity at an age where they wanted to think about important things. So I would share with them an insight I just had, and they would throw it back at me with spins on it I'd never thought of because of their distinctive experiences growing up in a very different place, or a very different time from the one in which I grew up. So that's the very cool thing about what you're doing, Joseph, in bringing people on here to share what they've been learning and what they've been seeing and doing. You give everybody who tunes in a chance to participate in their own thoughts and use these materials for their own creative insights.
I appreciate you saying that. And one of the things, as I was saying to you before, was part of the idea was I wanted to bring on my fellow speakers and authors and give them a platform, and afterwards send them the files that they could put into their reels, etc. But what I didn't bank on is so many things have come out of this that I just didn't bank on. One, I've been able to, and vice versa, meet amazing people and strike up real relationships and connections and friendships. Two, there are people that I would have considered to be my peers, my contemporaries, my industry colleagues that I'd seen 1,000 times, but I'd never said more than 5 words to, or spent 5 minutes with, I should say.
Yeah.
Said many words, networking, having a drink at a conference. And then I would say, you realize we've just sat down for 45 minutes, just the two of us having a conversation. We've never done that. And then the third part of it is the thinking. Yeah. And for me, like a personal goal is that one of my guests walks away going, I've got a new perspective on something that I was already thinking about, or a new inspiration or thought or idea. And it's done that with me as well, which has inspired new thinking. It's just been tremendous. So thank you for that. It's it's mutual.
I was saying to Joseph before we came on here, after we ended the main part of the show, I said, when I was on book tour for True Success and If Aristotle Ran General Motors in the mid-90s, they would send me to every major city in the U.S., the publishers did, and they had money back then. They would always put me up in the Ritz-Carlton of whatever city, and they'd send me to bookstores, and I'd be on their Good Morning San Diego, Good Morning Chicago, Good Morning whatever, and then I've been on their radio shows, whatever the hit radio show was in Detroit or in Kansas City, and the experiences were just extraordinary in terms of the conversations I ended up having. I was in a Barnes and Noble in Kansas City, and a guy was in this long line to get me to sign a copy of his book. And he said, I was driving my big rig across Nebraska and heard you on the Mike Murphy radio show. And I said, I got to meet this guy. And that got me up out of my chair. This is a truck driver who heard me on a radio show and made his way to the Kansas City Barnes and Noble so that we could have a conversation. I mean, so here you've created something. And I was telling Joseph in the break that, I got interviewed by Regis Philbin and Matt Lauer and the CNN International people and the CNBC people and in those days. And he's the best interviewer I think I've ever come across, because you really care about this, because you're a philosopher, and that means you're a learner. And that means you're a connector. There's a guy I know in California who seems to know everybody. And I mentioned that to him one day. His name is Brian. I said, Brian, you know everybody. And he says, funny you say that, because I've always felt weird about networking. Like it's this thing I'm not comfortable with. And I said, well, that's because most people do it manipulatively, and you don't. You're a great connector, and that's actually a spiritual discipline. It's a spiritual thing, because you create greater forms of good, greater networks through which the positive power can pass, And he said, geez, I never thought about it like that before. I said, you never start out with a relationship or putting two people together, what can I get out of this? And I've known people who did approach things that way, plenty, but there can be a purity of bringing people together that ends up being the most beneficial thing for you of all, and so congratulations on showing people how to do this right.
Amen, hallelujah. I am, I mean, that is one of the things that I've learned how to do a lot of things through this process. One is how to listen more and listen better, and the other one is how to take a compliment, and the best way to take a compliment is to say the words thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was, I appreciate that. And you know what, it's it's been an amazing journey, and it's been one that I've learned so much about myself, and I've learned from others, and yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. I can say with 100% certainty and confidence, one of the C's, maybe two of the C's, I forget if certainty is, but I will be standing in line to get some more lemonade whenever you're selling it.
Well, Tom, I want to say this too before I don't run out of time. I'm a student of philosophy, and I bought your book for dummies.
Oh, you got the dummies book.
I bought that 20 some years ago, and it was the first book I bought after reading Ayn Rand.
Oh yeah.
And understanding her approach to objectivism and her slam on Aristotle. And so I was just trying to figure out, like, okay, what is this philosophy thing? And at the time in my life, I was in, let's just say, a huge need of healing, and philosophy heals.
Yeah, it does.
And that's the one thing you mentioned in your presentation today that I wanted to comment on. I think that's astute. I think it's necessary, because philosophy obviously is a beginning point to understanding spirituality or introspection or understanding. And when you start studying, for me, and you also talked about the darkness, you know, I got into Kant and Hegel early on, and that threw me sideways.
Yeah,
so it was one of those things.
It has a way of doing that.
Yeah, I just got to get out of that.
Yeah.
And then you get into Spinoza and some rationalists, and you figure out, okay, this is some cool stuff. The Greeks have always been a big thing for me, but your book was funny. It was easy to read. It helped me understand all of the different genres.
Good.
I really didn't understand, you know, the words like epistemology, things that were just way over my pay grade at the time. So I've bought books on Joseph Show after meeting an author, but this is the first author I've met who I bought. And I bought your Aristotle General Motors book too, you know, as a business.
That's awesome, man. But that's where my family thanks you, you know. The Dummies book came about in an interesting way. I was giving a talk to 2,500 drugstore executives in Palm Beach, Florida, at the Breakers Hotel. And it was all the executives of CVS and Walgreens and all those folks. And so I was speaking on, I think it was the topic of true success. And a lady calls me 3 days later. She said, "Hey, I was in your audience in Palm Beach." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah, my boyfriend is executive vice president at CVS. I'm the acquisitions editor for the Dummies books." I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yeah, we want you to write philosophy for dummies." I said, "Well, wait a minute. Don't you guys do like gardening books and auto repair and stuff like that?" And because this was a long time ago. She said, "Yeah, but we're going to launch a new series of books in the For Dummies, lifetime learning books. We've gotten Thomas Hoving, the curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's agreed to do art for dummies. And if you'll agree to do philosophy for dummies, you and Hoving will launch our new enterprise."
Oh, wow.
And I said, "That's so cool." I said, "Well, look, I've never turned my intro class at Notre Dame into a book. What if I just channel what I would say on Monday morning, what I would say on Wednesday morning, and kind of supercharge it in light of what I've been learning in the world of business these years?" And she said, "That just sounds perfect." So, and I did it, you know, Joey, like you said, I did it the way I do everything. I had fun. I tell funny stories. All this because that's what Socrates did. That's what Kierkegaard did. I mean, some of my favorite philosophers, Epictetus, who kind of is an extreme guy. He's like the Marine drill sergeant for the soul, but he can crack me up sometimes, you know. I used to tell my graduate students, philosophy is a serious business, but that doesn't mean it has to be somber. You know, we can have fun while we're doing it. And I try to build that into everything I do.
Yeah, it was great. It helped me frame my learning. Let's just say
Wow,
that.
That's awesome.
It was wonderful. So I appreciate that.
Well, I got my editor for all my novels, and you will love the novels. I guarantee you that. TheOasisWithin.com. I got my editor for those books because he wrote me an angry letter about philosophy for dummies. He found it in a bookstore someplace. He said, "But wait a minute, you said this on page 179, and this other philosopher I really admire says the opposite here," and he quotes this guy, and he said, "How can these things both be true?" And I wrote him a letter explaining. And he wrote me back and he said, "That was a good explanation. What else of yours should I read?" And I said, "Go read The Oasis Within. My first short novel just came out. Go read that." Okay, you'll like this. So he emails me a few days later. "All right, I just read the first 5 pages. Way too simple." I read spiritual books and philosophy books all the time. This is way too simple for me at this stage of my life. I said, read the first 2 chapters and get back to me. Do that. Do me a favor. And so a week later, he writes me back, this is my favorite spiritual book I've ever read in my life. But it's full of humor. It's full of, all kinds of stories, but it's deep philosophy. That's what I'm always trying to bring together.
What's the name of that book specifically?
The first book in the series. It's a prologue to a series.
Okay.
So imagine, Lord of the Rings had the Hobbit that was for it. Well, this is called The Oasis Within. It's 180 pages. It's an easy read little story. A caravan is going from a village in Western Egypt to Cairo in 1934, the summer of 1934. And that book, a CEO from California wrote me and said, pages 5 and 6 of Oasis Within changed my life forever. And then I had to get in touch with this guy and find out why, how. And he told me, he said, it was the Oasis, it was the telescope stuff, Joseph, the telescope stuff. He said, I'm a screamer, I'm a yeller in bad negotiations, I get angry. And for the first time in my life, the worst negotiation I've ever been in, I'm calm for the first time in my life. Your emotional telescope has made all the difference for me. And for the first time I've gotten from a bad negotiation, I'm going to get the best result I've ever gotten because of that story in that book. And I said, well, yeah, we'll keep reading, let me know what you think. But then there are 7 big volumes after that, 400 to 600 pages each, that come after the Oasis. And the action and adventure starts in the very next book called The Golden Palace. The action and the adventure start, and people have said, I have one student whose books always get praised in the New York Times. He's a novelist. And he read The Golden Palace and he said, this is Harry Potter meets Indiana Jones meets Aristotle. Keep doing this, he said. And I said, well, it's not up to me. If they come to me, I write them down. If they don't come to me, I'll go do something else, like Socrates in Silicon Valley, like the Steve Jobs book.
I will check it out. I
think you'd have fun. I would love to hear from you. A guy who's done all the philosophy reading you've done. Let me know what you think. I love.
Oh, I'll hit you up. I'll hit you up on LinkedIn or something. But I'll read those.
That's really cool.
I wanted to share with you a thought, which was, 10 years ago, I wrote Flip the Funnel. And the argument was that we're all focused and obsessed on acquisition, which is the traditional sales and marketing funnel.
Yep.
AIDA, that goes from, from wide to narrow. And I said, well, why does it get smaller over time? And why is it open at the end? And what happens afterwards? And I asked all these questions, and I said, and why is it linear? Because we're not predictable. And so I flipped it, and by flipping it, the funnel, but in doing so, I said, well, how would we fix it? Well, we could make it go thinner and thinner and thinner until it eventually becomes a little tail, but then it looked like a sperm. I said, let's not do that. And so I eventually flipped it. But before I did, I referenced Seth Godin, who said, well, what if we turn the funnel into a megaphone? And so he turned it on its side. And I said, no, we need to turn it completely around.
Yeah.
Now, long story short, at the end of the book, I wrote a chapter called Flip the Funnel for Your Personal Life. And I said how we could approach the same thing. The funnel should get bigger over time, whether it's happiness, whether it's fulfillment, whether it's learning, that nothing should ever diminish over time. And the reason I bring all of this up is 10 years after that book was published, I've now turned that book into a course. And so I had to create little vignettes for each chapter. And I came up with a new one, which is, what if we actually turned the funnel into a telescope? Oh. How ironic is that?
Yeah, that's interesting.
And the perspective again of seeing the bigger picture, zooming out. It was just amazing as you were talking about the telescope and thinking about how 10 years after I wrote this book, I learned something new, and I was able to build and evolve the thinking. And of course, part of the idea was, if you were miserable in your job coming into this pandemic, why would you return to that afterwards? This is your moment to change your course.
Yeah, we've got masses of people who just can't wait to get back to exactly what was going on in January, right? As if that's everybody's goal should be get back to the way things were as quick as we possibly can. Whereas maybe that's not the opportunity here at all. It's something very different. And the funny thing that you use the image of a telescope. My editor for my irritated editor, who became such a good editor for my novels, He's 90 years old. He just turned 90. His name is Bruce May, Dr. Bruce May. And Dr. May, he would say, no, the telescope thing, you and me with telescopes, that's no bizarre little coincidence. That's a serendipity. That's a synchronicity. He sees things like this happening in his life all the time. People come together, like the fact that he was writing me an irritated letter about dummies, and he ends up becoming my editor for maybe 9 or 10 books. And it's just the novels themselves. That's a major theme in the novels, that there's a complexity to the world behind the scenes, between the lines. There are things going on that we don't even have a hint about, but that sometimes crop up in these synchronicities and these serendipities. In fact, that's a word that's used a lot in Silicon Valley, in the tech world, serendipity. You know, two guys taking a walk at just a random time of day, and they meet each other on the sidewalk, and they're both doing startups, and they get together and they do PayPal. You know, it's just, it reinforces this thing that it's always about, well, Aristotle in the Politics, in his book, The Politics, he has this, and he never makes it as clear and succinct and in these words, but this is my, like, reading the whole thing and just boiling it down. The highest human good comes out of this: people, plural, in partnership, a certain kind of relation, for a shared purpose. People in partnership for a shared purpose. Mm-hmm. And so when we find those people come into our lives as a serendipity, and we form that partnership that was kind of waiting to be formed. And we end up with these shared purposes that we can do amazing things. And that's why so many people who've written on the history of innovation and creativity have focused on Athens. It wasn't just one guy in ancient Athens. And how about the Renaissance? It wasn't just one person in the Renaissance. There's a bunch of people. How about the Impressionists hanging out with each other in cafes all the time, and all the early 20th century novelists who were in Paris at the time, and got to meet each other, and got to meet the poets, and got to meet the painters and the sculptors, and it's this wonderful effervescent collaboration that ends up happening in ways you never could have imagined.
By the way, we were just joined by Steve Messi, who's now changed his name to Greetings from Athens.
Oh, very good.
When I say Steve Messi, it's Stavros.
Nice to see you, man. Nice to see you from the home place of everything.
Now I can see. I just saw a tiny little icon. Now I realize. Welcome. Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful concept. One of my favorite quotes and of all time is the definition of community. It's a group of strangers who care about each other a little bit more than they should. And I also like that concept because, in a way, we're a community now. All of these shows, interviews have turned into a community. By the way, thanks to our friend Ivy, I'm doing something which I will be sharing with you soon. That looks back at 100 interviews,
wow.
Basically tipping my hand, and looks at all these insights and reflections and lessons and learnings. But now I think I need to reframe it as a lesson in philosophy.
That's what it sounds like, you know. And it's funny because I was going to ask you. I was just getting ready to ask you, how many of these have you done? And that's an impressive accomplishment.
Yeah, so I think I've done over 80 now, 82, 83.
Wow.
And you talk about serendipity. My first interview was my sister. She lives in London. I was talking to her, and she was telling me she has a spinning studio. 30 bikes, and they were faced with closing down or closing their doors because of the pandemic. And her quote, I never forgot a quote actually when I interviewed her, was, I knew that if I closed the doors, I would close them for good.
Wow.
And so she put all of the bikes in one of those U-Hauls.
Uh-huh.
She sent an email out to all of her customers saying who would like a bike, and she started experimenting with Vimeo and Instagram Live and essentially streaming, almost doing what Peloton takes for granted.
Yeah.
And so I said to her, you should come on my show. Let me interview you. Let me just highlight the power of the entrepreneur and resilience and grit And had I not done that, I wouldn't have probably switched to an interview format.
Wow.
Which now 85, 82, 83 interviews later is just gaining momentum. And I'm learning so much about myself and learning from others. And it all just came down from, I mean, it's funny how, Tom, sometimes in life, you can recognize the moment when you're lucky enough to recognize a moment. Because even when people have asked me, why did you start the show? And I'm like, I don't know. I just did.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't have to know. I just did. I mean, the only answer I give people is I just did what I know naturally to do, which is to create content and try and help. But I'm not sure that there was a brief or a calculated Machiavellian move. Yeah. I just did it.
And see, this says something to all those people who say, well, no, you got to have a business plan. You got to have, get yourself a board of directors, get this all, most people wouldn't take a single step if they had to do all that to start with, right? It's this magical alchemy of taking that for those first steps down a path. You don't have to have a 5-year plan, right? When I left Notre Dame, people were saying, well, how do you know that businesses are going to still be asking you to give these talks 6 months from now? You're giving up a guaranteed job for life. You're giving up 20 years of guaranteed income, and you don't have any reason to believe that this thing's going to continue. And I said, look, my father taught me his philosophy that life is supposed to be a series of adventures. And he said, the one you're on now is setting you up for the next one in ways you often can't even imagine. And the adventures you've had in the past have made this one possible. And so just be open to the next adventure. So I was open to leaving Notre Dame, and I was open. You mentioned, we mentioned in our session the bank that asked me to give a talk on change. Rather than say, no, I don't, that's not one of my topics, I said, sure, let me look into it. And then another guy, a company, I'd spoken to their global leadership team 3 times on 3 of my standard topics. And the guy called me and said, look, we're reading Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs. And it's like, Jobs was the biggest jerk in the history of the world, but he created the world's most valuable company. You got to come and give us a talk about how that's even possible. And rather than saying, well, I know nothing about Steve Jobs, I'm not your guy, I said, all right, let me look into it. And before you knew it, I had watched every video, heard every audio, read every book. I talked one Sunday afternoon, all afternoon, to the first guy Steve Jobs ever sold a computer to. I sat down for coffee with one of his direct reports twice, 3 times. That guy shared with me faxes that Isaac had never seen. People told me stories that none of the biographers ever asked about. And it was because I was willing to say, okay, let me look into it. It's like you with this show, right? You didn't start off with this grand plan. Here's a business plan. Let me see if I can get some VCs to invest in it. We're going to do this giant, no. It's like, hey, to your sister, hey, let me interview you for who knows where this is going to go, right? So that's the way things grow organically.
And Tom, one of the things I love to show sometimes, which is if I take my camera, you've got my 2 Nike shoe boxes.
Oh, that's so funny.
That the laptop sits on, my very rough show notes, which are not really, just my one lamp, my green screen. Well, there's the green screen up there.
That's so fun.
And my lamps, and it's part of the process is resisting the urge to over-engineer and
You're
to
right.
become because part of the message is you can do this too.
Oh, because
you guys out there.
Right. If you say, hey, I think I'm going to do a video cast on the internet, then everybody's going to have so much equipment you have to buy that's tens of thousands of dollars, right? And I think to myself, okay, I was on the Today Show where they own Rockefeller Center, and they've got, the room was so full of people and equipment, and you do the better interview, and yet at the time, Matt Lauer, who has had trouble since then, Matt Lauer did by far the best interview of anybody who interviewed me. The Good Morning San Diego people were just, the CNBC people were desperately flipping through my book during the commercial break and trying to find something to ask me, and then would say, tell us about your book. Matt Lauer, his producer, gave me a list of questions he was going to ask me, like 12 questions. No. When the interview started, he had read the book and he started asking me his own questions. It's like we went off on this like 9-minute deal that was just, impossible for network television. But you're better than that. And they had the equipment and the people and the structures. And so that just kind of shows you, right? Socrates started off barefoot with one toga walking down the street. Hey, come over here. Let me ask you something. I mean, that's the way things start. So good for you, man.
Well, I've decided based on that endorsement that from now on I am barefoot right now, but I'm going to start to wear a toga, and so you've given me my proper my calling. I'm going to take this philosophy thing really seriously now.
That's good. That's good.
But what did you say? Serious but not somber.
Yeah, that's right. It's serious, but it's not somber, man. And you say, anybody says, well, you don't have a degree in philosophy. Neither did Socrates, right? Neither did neither did some of the best people in history. I mean, all it requires is you really thinking hard about things that matter, right? And you're helping other people to do it. And that, to me, is part of the secret sauce right there.
Well, listen, the head is exploding right now. It's expanding so much. No, I appreciate it, and I appreciate what you're saying because it's coming from you. And I picked up as well when I spoke about focus. And I hope people that are on Facebook now, and this will close it down after this. Especially some of the commenters about when you hit bottom, etc. You left security, safety, comfort, stability. Most people actually cannot do that. They need to be pushed in order to start. Right. So it is very unusual for someone to break away from that comfort. And in a way, you might have been a specialist in philosophy, but you were certainly a generalist and maybe maybe less initiated, if you want to say, in terms of what it is to be a public speaker, but you brought that innocence, that originality, that perspective, that focus, that differentiation. You tackled it differently. You tackled it in your own way, and that's how you found your niche and your place in this global keynote scene.
Yeah, it's amazing to me that I just, a Chamber of Commerce group asked me to give a free talk on ethics. And rather than saying, well, that's not what I do, I said, yeah, sure, let me look into it. And what I decided it was for young business people. About the time of the Oldsmobile talk, the young business people in the community deemed to be future leaders. So I thought, well, first of all, I got to go read some books on ethics. And secondly, I got to find out what's on their minds. I got to listen to the audio tapes. These motivational guys like Zig Ziglar, this was back in the 80s. I got to get all these tapes. And so I got the tapes and listened. And then what are the best-selling books, business books they're reading? There were 2 books on the bestseller list that month, New York Times bestseller list, that were business books. Iacocca, Lee Iacocca's autobiography, and the now notorious The Art of the Deal by not actually Donald Trump, somebody else. But anyway, I read those 2 books. I said, well, there are things here that show me what people need to hear about ethics, right? So I just came in, I've always come in just trying to say, how can I make a difference for good here? And I've helped some young philosophers get involved in this public thing. And I've always said to them, impact over income. Don't ever have income as your primary reason for doing this. Nothing wrong with the income, but the income will come best and most reliably if your first concern is impact, positive impact for good on the people you're helping. And so I left Notre Dame with no guarantees, giving up 20 years of guaranteed income. My second year independent philosopher, my income that year was almost exactly 20 times my Notre Dame salary. making up for all the years I had given up. And I remember saying to my wife, well, it's all icing on the cake from here on out. So, you know, the thing about doing what you love, and the people who do, the irony is those people who, I got to major in something that's secure. Usually that's a shot in the dark. What looks secure while they're majoring 6 years out or 4 years out of college, that's not secure at all anymore, right? So they lose that job that they gave up their true love to do this, to be whatever, XYZ, and then that's collapsed on them. So the only real security is living your proper adventure.
And if you remember Jim Carrey telling that story, Jim Carrey's dad was an accountant.
Yeah.
And he was an accountant because it was safe. And Jim Carrey talks about how phenomenally funny his dad was.
Wow.
For the family, and he was always entertaining. And he obviously didn't do that for a living. And then he got laid off, you know, in his 40s. And Jim Carrey said, you know what, no matter what, I'm going to do what I love because my dad did what he hated and failed. He said, so I'm going to give it a shot. And obviously the rest is history there.
You know, by the way, and we'll wind it down after this, but on my run this morning, I just finished Jim Carrey's interview on Howard Stern. And it's actually very interesting. I think I'm going to have to get this book, Tom, after I've read yours. But so Jim Carrey's written a book, and it's called, what's it called? It's called like Misinformation and in Misgivings or something. And it's about a character called Jim Carrey. And so it is, it's kind of bizarre. So it's fictional, but it's not fictional. And he talks about relationships, and he talks about people that are composites of other people. And it just seems very, you know, and it's sci-fi as well. So like Rodney Dangerfield's conscious has been downloaded into a machine so he can interact with his mentor. And but it sounds very, very philosophical and very interesting in terms of how he talks about his dad. That's what made me think of it. Maybe I'll read it and let you know.
Do that, because wisdom comes from surprising places, right? I mean, Robin Williams in his time could go on to could get into a spiral of creativity out of which you never knew what was going to come, right? And Jim Carrey, I can see the very same thing happening with a book by him, that for all the off the wall things, they're going to be really insightful things. And let me know about that. That's great.
Well, we're gonna. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording on Facebook, and just say to all of you on Facebook, thank you for watching. This was amazing. I'm just feeling very blessed to have had this moment with you today, Tom.
Thank you, Miss Ivy at Gotham Speakers, who introduced